Hello, this is Brian Long. Everyone can benefit from being a little more efficient in what they spend time doing on a day-to-day basis. By the time this session is over, it's my goal that everyone will have picked up some little tip, and hopefully a whole bundle of tips, to make their use of the Delphi or C++ Builder IDE just a bit more efficient. I've been working with Delphi and C++ Builder as a freelance consultant, developer, troubleshooter, trainer, writer and mentor ever since the pre-release days of each of these products, often working with customers to improve their knowledge of Delphi and C++ Builder by introducing them to techniques and features they may be unfamiliar with. Being someone who finds the keyboard a more efficient means of achieving many goals on a computer, I made a point of finding out keystroke shortcut equivalents for many features that are available through menus and mouse usage, and additionally, keystrokes for features that seem to be unique to keyboard invocation. So without further ado, let's press on with this session and take a tour of my favourite shortcuts and lesser known features of the Rad Studio IDE. Many of these features date back years to the early versions of Delphi, and some of them have only been introduced in the more recent versions. To find out if your favourite version supports any of these features, your best bet is to try them out. Here we are in the Rad Studio IDE. We have some Delphi source code here. We also have some C++ source code here for some comparison, as most of the features work equally between the two languages, which is terrific. The first set of features we'll look at were introduced a long time ago, back in the days of Delphi 3, a whopping 15 years ago. These features were added in under the umbrella term of Code Insight, and they represent a number of features which we kind of take completely for granted now, but before Delphi 3 they simply weren't there. So let's have a look in a subroutine here. The sort of thing that Code Insight include is this pop-up window, the code completion window, which, as you know, typically pops up after you type in an expression and a dot in Delphi to indicate that you want some members, or alternatively an arrow sign in C++. And it does pop up automatically when you press the symbol, but sometimes it's nice to be able to pop the window up manually. For example, like that, and the keystroke for that is Control Space. Control Space brings up the Code Insight window. One or two things about the Code Insight window: it's not necessarily that well known that it is resizable, but it is. It's also sortable. By default, all the items that pop up in the code completion window are sorted by scope, uses clause, unit scope. You can right click on it and choose to alphabetize everything in the list as well. Code Insight is one of them. Another one that is quite common is this little tooltip that shows you the parameter lists of all of the overloads of the method whose parameter list you just opened. This is called the code parameters window, and it pops up again automatically, but sometimes it's nice to be able to go back to a parameter list and invoke the code parameters window manually, which you can do using Control Shift Space. Up it pops. Of course, the nice thing about code parameters is that the parameter that you're on is emboldened, so you know which one you need to be paying attention to. Another rather helpful addition with Code Insight is the list of code templates. These ones are less well used than code parameters and code completion, simply because they don't pop up automatically and the keystroke is completely non-intuitive. The keystroke is Control J. With Control J you get a list of templates. Again, this is a resizable window. It's a list of templates which is possibly too large for the convenience that the feature offers. Maybe it would be easier to type in the first couple of letters of what you're looking for. So maybe you're looking for a template for a for loop. Put in the first couple of characters, press Control J, you get just the for loops, which is quite handy. There's a reverse for loop, and similarly, if we were looking for a class, we could ask for a class declaration in that sort of manner. So these code templates can be very handy. Back in Delphi 2006, Delphi's code templates had a bit of a transformation into live templates, which were a little bit more dynamic and often pop up automatically. So for example, going back to the for loop again, if we do type in for, we automatically get a template in place where tab does take us from one element to another. We can define either simple, relatively simple code templates, or indeed these dynamic live templates, reasonably straightforwardly. The syntax for a live template is a little unwieldy, but there is documentation out there on the net to enable you to build them. In fact, perhaps let's have a quick look at building a simple template to make it easier to type in calls to message dialog, which is, let's be fair, a fairly regularly called function. What we need is a new code template. We can either pick one from File, New, Other, or alternatively on the code palette, the tool palette down here, we can choose a code template. And let's save it in a minute. What we've got here is an XML file with a load of bits that we need to fill in. So firstly, we need to give the code template a name. We need to specify whether it's only manually invocable or whether it can be automatically invoked. We need to give it a description. And maybe specify an author. And then the most important part, of course, is the actual code that's going to be inserted when the code template is made use of. So I'll just put in the basic call to message dialog, or an example call. So that's a basic sample call. If we use this code template to insert that call, we then need to go back and change anything that needed changing, such as the message type, the buttons, and so on. To make it a bit more dynamic and easier to update once it's been inserted, we can make it a live template. And to do that, we need to insert a number of substitution points. And the substitution points look like this. Each one's got a name, and also each one has some text and a hint. And for the three things that are likely to need updating, we'll need 3 of these substitution points. So one of them will be called message, one of them will be called message type, one of them will be called message buttons. The default text for message will be blah blah. The default text for message type will be information, empty information, and the default text for message buttons will be MBOK. We can put in a little hint to the user. And then what we need to do is actually reference these substitution points in the live template. To do so, we also need to specify that the language is Delphi. To do so, we need to mention that the delimiter being used is a pipe sign. And then we can put in pairs of pipe signs at the places that we want these substitution points, and then we can copy the names of the substitution points in between the pipe signs. I'm using control drag to copy a highlighted block of text. Just dragging text moves it. Control drag copies it. It's the same in Microsoft Word. What else do we need to do? Yeah, at the end, once all the substitution points have been dealt with, we need to indicate where to leave the cursor at the end of the job. And that's done like that. So let's save this template. By default, code templates are stored in the user profile Rad Studio code templates folder. Okay, so that's saved the template away, and hopefully that means if we go back to the code, type in MSG, the first few letters of my code template's name, which was MSG DLG, press Ctrl J, it gives us a list of 1 template starting with that. If we press Enter, it allows us to type in that sort of thing. And when you press Tab the final time, that's where the live template ends. The fact that it's automatically invocable means that if we type in the name of the template and press space or tab, it will automatically invoke the code template because it recognises the name. So code templates or live templates, very handy. Live templates as they have been since Delphi 2006. Okay. Just before moving on, I guess we should make another code template and pretty much replicate what we had there, but just prove that it also works with C++ in exactly the same way. So we'll just change that, change the language to C, and then change the code to be C++-esque. So that is necessary. And that. So I think that then makes it valid C++. So let's close and save that. Nip over to the C++ code that I've got over here and go to a gap here, MSG, Control-J. Yeah, so it works exactly the same. There's no difference whatsoever. Other aspects of Code Insight that have been added in include Tooltip Help Insight. This is where we pause our mouse over a symbol and we get a rich text pop-up telling us the type and the unit that the type comes from. Let's try one that's got a bit more information. Button one click. It tells us the type, it tells us the source file, it tells us the location in the source file, it gives us information about parameters. It's quite rich information. We can enrich it further if we wish, by using XML comments, which is, to be honest, it's a bit tedious to do manually. So it's therefore very handy that recent versions of RAD Studio have come with a light version of DevJet's Documentation Insight product. Documentation Insight is available on the Tools menu. If we choose Show Documentation, it brings us up a little window, which perhaps we'll just dock here, and it allows us to put in a summary for the symbol that was under the cursor. Oh, this okay. I must admit, I did think that we're on button one click. Let's try that again. Okay, so we type in the various bits and it puts in the appropriate XML comment syntax for us. Now the point of this is that when we then hover our mouse over a symbol, we do get this richer information. So here we do have the summary, we have the description of the parameter and the remark at the end. Now Tooltip Help Insight appears when you pause your mouse over a symbol. In addition, I think we'll find in Code Completions pop-up, when you select an item that also has XML comment syntax, you'll find that to the right of the selected item, the same rich window pops up, so that's quite handy. In addition, you can have this window pop up of your own volition if you're just moving around with the keyboard. Control-Shift-H will give you the Tooltip Help Insight for the symbol under the cursor. Now, Tooltip Help Insight, very, very useful, but it has actually taken over from what the original pop-up tooltip functionality was inside of Code Insight prior to Delphi 8, I should imagine. The original one was called Tooltip Symbol Insight, and it's still there, but it's only there if you disable Tooltip Help Insight. So, to control the Code Insight options, we can go into the Tools Options dialog and locate the Code Insight page of options, where we could control and customize how code completion works, the code parameters window. We can turn off Tooltip Help Insight, leaving Tooltip Symbol Insight on. And now when we pause our mouse over a symbol, we just get the old school simple tooltip which tells us that it's a procedure type symbol. It tells us the signature, and it tells us the source file and the line number of the definition. So we have an option. We can either have the big rich window or a tiny little tooltip. It's up to our discretion. Another feature in Code Insight is Error Insight. You'll doubtless have seen the feature. When you type in something that the compiler is not happy about, it puts a little red squiggle under it, and assuming the structure window is available, it then, in addition to the normal hierarchical view of the contents of the current source file, we also get a list of errors that the compiler has found, or that the compiler thinks it's found. A big bugbear of mine over the past few versions, well, I'm not sure how many, but several versions of Delphi, is that the Error Insight window is somewhat delicate in its integrity. On many an occasion you will see errors which simply don't exist, and no matter what you do to try and tell the compiler that you fixed the problems or that the problem isn't there, the problems persist, and you have to shut Delphi and restart it to clear this cache of ghost errors. To be honest, this does frustrate me, so my personal recommendation is to go back into the Code Insight options, turn Error Insight off. That problem has disappeared. Maybe if Error Insight ever becomes reliable in terms of matching the compiler's behaviour, then I'll be happy to turn it back on, but until then it's gone. What, however, I do rely upon and do find very useful and practical is code browsing. Code browsing is all about being taken to the definition or declaration of a symbol. So, for example, input query, if I want to find out what that's defined or implemented, I can right-click and choose Find Declaration, be taken to its implementation in the Delphi VCL source. Similarly, in a C++ file, if I want to find out where message DLG is declared, I can right-click, choose Find Declaration, and be taken to the relevant declaration in one of the VCL header files. That's a context menu. The more widely known shortcut for doing this type of finding this type of location of declaration is done by holding the control key down and then waving your mouse around in the source file. Anything that in theory has a declaration that you can be taken to will be turned into a hyperlink. If you click on the hyperlink, you'll be taken to that symbol. So if I hold down the control key and click on Format, I'll be taken to the implementation of format. Same thing in C++. If I hold down the control key, click on try stress int, I'll be taken to the declaration for it. The idea is, because it turns into a hyperlink and you click the link, it's a bit like web browsing, so they call it code browsing. And very much like a web browser, we have a code browsing history. This is affected by these buttons here, so we can go backwards and forwards through the code browsing history, and we can also do that using Alt left arrow and Alt right arrow. Now, control and a click is not exactly a keystroke shortcut, it's a combination of key and a mouse. There is, however, an additional shortcut that is keystroke only. So let's go back to, well, let's close down a few of these. Tidy things up a bit. So the keystroke in question is Alt up arrow. So if you hold down the Alt key and press the up cursor key, that will do exactly the same job with keyboard alone. Now, that's pretty much the end of the original Code Insight set of features. It was a handsome set of features, I'll certainly attest to that. However, it's certainly not the end of the source code navigation keystroke, so let's move on and see some more. Okay, let's just tidy up a little bit more. Back to some my simple Delphi file. Okay, method hopping. This was introduced a few versions back, and it's quite neat. If you want to, it's more useful in a larger source file, but we'll just work with this this smaller one, and then perhaps we'll open up a VCL source file to just check that it works there as well. The idea is we can move between the methods by holding down Control and Alt and doing various things. Control Alt Home takes you to the first subroutine or method. You'll notice there are no more above this message function. Control Alt End, excuse me. Control Alt End takes you to the last one. Control Alt Up goes upwards. Control Alt Down goes downwards. And Control Alt and scrolly mouse wheel, you may be able to hear my mouse wheel scrolling, allows me to similarly scroll through the methods. The same thing works in C++. Let's see. Let's open up a given class. Here's one. This will do. This has got some methods. and use the mouse wheel, or indeed Control Alt down arrow, and you'll see that it bounces down from method to method to method to method all the way through a source file. However, maybe you're specifically interested in a particular class, in which case you can press Control QL and that does a class lock. And so what that means is when you're scrolling down, it will keep scrolling down until it gets to the last method of that class. Oh, there it is. And then won't scroll down any further. So I've got to the last method of tCustomForm and it hasn't scrolled down into tForm. However, if I press Control QL again, that will toggle the class lock back off, and then Control Alt down arrow will scroll through tForm, tCustom, DocWindow, tScreen, and so on and so on. So method hopping, quite a nice keystroke set. Method hopping works in Delphi and C++ Builder. In earlier versions of Delphi, before method hopping came along, there was already a navigation keystroke called module navigation. This is a very nice keystroke which allows you to jump between the implementation and the declaration of a given subroutine or method. So, for example, in this VCL source file that I'm in now, I'm in the implementation of tscreen.getMonitor. If I hold down Control and Shift and press either up or down arrow, that will take me to the declaration of getMonitor. And pressing either up or down arrow again will take me back to the implementation. And obviously the same thing works with my own code, be it a global subroutine or indeed a method. This is a Delphi only thing. This one doesn't work in C++ Builder. Now, going away from navigation onto more general things to do with source code manipulation, indenting and outdenting. It used to be quite difficult to do the indenting and outdenting because you did have to remember a specific keystroke. Nowadays, Tab and Shift Tab do work. However, in earlier versions of Delphi, you had to remember either Control Shift I and Control Shift U, or Control KI and Control KU. And then there was also the additional problem of taking up on somebody else's code which was laid out in a less than personally favourable manner. Was it Delphi XE or was it Delphi XE2? Over the recent couple of versions we have had introduced into the product a source code formatter, a pretty printer, which is very customisable. We can find the pretty printer on the edit menu, edit format source, and as you can see, Control D is what we're looking at. So if we press Control D, well, the first time we'll get a confirmation dialog, and indeed we'll subsequently always get a confirmation dialog unless we tell it not to bother. So that allows it to reformat the source, and the same thing actually applies with C++. So if we just unformat this source here, press Control D, that will reformat it. If we want, we can go into the Tools Options dialog, go and find the formatter, and we have C++ and Delphi options to customize exactly how the source gets relayed out, and it's very customizable with various profiles that you can set up. Okay, let's just tidy this up a little bit again. Now, back in the Delphi source file, sometimes it's useful to be able to just jump straight to a given line that you're hunting down. In some text editors it's Control-G, but not in the Rad Studio text editor. There it is Alt-G. So Alt-G brings up the go-to line number box. Maybe we want to jump to line 75. Sometimes it'd be useful to be able to go back to a place that we were editing text in. This is where bookmarks come in. We can drop up to 10 bookmarks in each source file in the IDE. We can do it using the context menu. Let's say, for example, we wanted to toggle bookmark 1 on here and go down here and then jump back to bookmark 1. We can do it with the context menu, that's fair enough. We can also do it using keystrokes. So to drop a bookmark, maybe drop bookmark number 2, we can do Control Shift 2. And in order to go back to bookmark number 2, we can do Control 2. This works very nicely. Control Shift number and then Control number. Works quite nicely, except for, let's see, Control Shift 9 works. Control 9 works. The one that doesn't work is Control Shift 0. And for that we need to revert back to the much older classic keystrokes. So the other keystrokes for dealing with bookmarks are Control K and a number, so Control K6, and in order to go to it, Control Q and a number, 6. And if we do Control K0, that does drop bookmark 0, and hopefully Control Q 0 also goes back to it. Bookmarks are great. It used to be the case that bookmarks were not saved in the desktop file, so every time you close the project, even if you were saving the desktop file, you would lose all of your bookmarks. For those older versions of Delphi, use a breakpoint. Drop breakpoints over the place, disable the breakpoints, and use the breakpoints window as a means for bouncing to the target breakpoint to take you back to a place in the source code. However, in more recent versions, Delphi now does store the bookmarks in the desktop, and let's just prove that by closing this project. And then reopening it again, and yeah, all of our bookmarks are now restored. A delightful change. If we're working with COM or indeed other systems which require unique numbers, it's often the case that GUIDs or GUIDs are employed. The keystroke in the Delphi editor for adding a GUID is Control-Shift-G, and it adds it in excuse me, it adds it in with the braces, the apostrophes and the square brackets. That was a bit of a random one. Something that does come in very handy. Sometimes you want to rename a variable. You can obviously select a block of text and then bring up the search and replace box and say I want to change numstr to be numstring only in the selected text. That's fair enough. But that will also change occurrences of that string in comments and inside strings, and sometimes it will be overzealous in its replacing. A very nice feature was added somewhere around about Delphi 2006, and it's called Sync Edit. You may notice whenever you highlight a block of text that there's this little icon that appears with a picture of, well, if you took a quick look at it, it might look like a pair of binoculars, but in fact it's a pair of pencils stuck together with little strips of wood, one of those multiple writing devices that you may have played with as a kid. The idea with Sync Edit, which we can invoke by pressing it, or as you can see from the tooltip by pressing Control-Shift-J, is that as soon as we invoke it, it will identify all the identifiers which have more than one instance, and so therefore can be multiply simultaneously edited. So numstr and num and msg would appear to be the only identifiers in this block which have multiple occurrences. So if I want to change numstr to be numstring, or maybe number string, press tab to move to the next identifier, and you can see that this, just editing one of the instances changes all of them en masse. The alternative is to use the refactoring engine to modify a symbol. So for example, maybe I want to change number string, so what I can do is choose refactor, rename variable. Control-Shift-E is the shortcut for that. So if we use Control-Shift-E, we could say number string new name. It will list out all the occurrences of number string, and then we can apply the refactoring and it will change number string to be number string new name in all occurrences there. So one or the other is great. Sync Edit is it just looks nice though, and it feels lovely. A related feature in the refactoring engine which can be quite valuable at times is the references locator. We can press Control-Shift-Enter on a symbol and it will give us a list of all the references to that symbol that it can find in the compiled code. In this case there are 4 references to that symbol. Same thing works in C++. How many references are there to numstr? Oops, that was Control-Shift-E, Control-Shift-Enter. Finding symbol references, and it says, yep, I've got 1, 2, 3 of them, which is probably about fair enough. 1, 2, 3 of them. Some other things which I found valuable, well, it's less valuable in Windows 8, where by default caps lock makes a noise when you turn it on and off. That is one of the accessibility settings that you could optionally turn on in earlier versions of Windows, but is on by default in Windows 8. However, disregarding that, not being a touch typist myself, I often have fallen foul of typing lots of text with caps lock on. And the point is, because I'm not a touch typist, I'm not looking at the screen, I can type in several lines of it, and then when I look up, I frown and I am sad, because I have lots of text to replace with the inverted case. However, all is not lost in the Delphi IDE, making sure we turn caps lock back to the right setting. If you highlight the block of code, my favourite keystroke, which is actually not in the list of keystrokes that are in the online help, is Control-OU, which inverts the case of the marked block of text. Actually, let's put that back. Another couple of keystrokes which are handy. Control-T deletes the word to the right of the cursor, and Control-Backspace deletes the word to the left of the cursor. Additionally, Control-Y deletes the current line. Other ones which were noteworthy, Control// will toggle between commenting and uncommenting a block. If you want to open up a unit whose name is under the cursor, that's Control-Enter. And Control-F4 closes the current file. One that's probably not very useful at all, but I'll just mention it for some sort of vague level of completeness. Control-OO will insert all of the compiler directives at the top of the unit, making sure that they will take precedence over any further changes in the project options. So that ends up looking like this. You've got all the short version of most of the compiler directives at the top, and then you've got all the warnings listed out below. As I say, probably not that useful, but maybe of vague interest. Control-Y, Control-Y, Control-Y. If you have a lot of source files open in the editor, using this little arrow here gives you a list of them, but if you're stuck with your keyboard, Control-Alt-F12 gives you the same functionality. If you want to search for something in the environment, well, you probably know that in recent versions the search boxes, the normal search, Control-F, is no longer a modal box, but a non-modal search has always existed, which is the incremental search. So maybe I want to search for number or something along those lines. Control-E invokes incremental search, N-U-M-B-E-R. So you can see that it's a progressive search, and can often be a bit more efficient than trying to search for an exact string, which could be quite a long one that you need to type in. If you want to get access to the tool palette, well, obviously you can use the equivalent of the tool palette, File, New, Other, gives you much the same functionality. But if you do want to access the tool palette and you don't want to stretch for your mouse, Control-Alt-P will take you to the tool palette, make it focused, and specifically allow you to type into the search box. So maybe I want to make another code template. So having pressed Control-Alt-P, I can just type in code, press enter, I've got another code template set up. Obviously this works just as well from the form designer. So let's get rid of these, give ourselves a bit more. The form designer, Control-Alt-P, maybe I want an edit box. Actually, talking of the tool palette, you may of course remember the component palette, favoured by many until it was removed some versions back. If you do want the component palette, recent versions of Delphi, I think XE2 onwards, have introduced it back again, so we can add it on, and that again has got a searching facility. However, the best searching facility of all is called IDE Insight. Control dot brings up the dialog, and it allows me to search across pretty much everything. The tool palette, the component palette, the various options dialog. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, I want to control the optimization setting of the compiler. So if I just start typing in optimization, there I am taken to the relevant setting, and if I press OK, it takes me to the optimization setting in the project options dialog. So Control dot is IDE Insight is great. Now, how about the history tab, which many people completely ignore? The history tab shows various saved versions of your file up to a certain amount controlled in the options dialog. These are stored in a hidden history subfolder, and they're obviously there for good version control, but we can do difference comparisons. So maybe I want to check what the differences are between the current file and the file that was saved 4 saves ago. I can check the differences looking at this difference viewer, but I'm not sure that I get on with it that well. With the latest version of Delphi, it does come equipped with a light version of Beyond Compare, so perhaps I can launch the 2 files in Beyond Compare and see, which I'm quite familiar with because I use Beyond Compare normally, and see the differences in a more understandable manner. Can be handy. Okay. Let's now see if we can find a good use for keystroke macro recording. Let's say that I'm writing some low-level Windows code and I want to log some information about Windows messages that come in. And in order to do that, what I want to do is to turn a message constant into a message string. So what I'm going to do is have a great big case statement, which is something like case message of, and then, well, I need some message constants, so let's find out where they live. They're in here. Control Enter to open that file. Right. So here's a bunch of them. Let's just take a handful. That'll do for now. That'll do for now. What I'm going to do is make use of the keystroke macro record to change one of these cases into the kind of statement or the kind of case expression that I want, and I'm going to use the macro playback to then apply the same changes to all the other lines. So what do I need to do? For each of these messages, I need to say something like, let's see, Control-Shift-R to go into keystroke macro recording mode, and we're going to go to the beginning of the line, press Control-Y because we don't need the compiler directive. Then we're going to say Control-Right. I need to get this into the clipboard, Control-KT to highlight the current word, Control-C to clipboard copy. Then right arrow, left arrow, result is assigned, format message is Control-V. Oh, actually, it wasn't. Format's not needed, is it? So in fact, let's just Shift-N, delete, Control-Left, left. Get rid of that lot. Down to the next line, press Home. All of those keystrokes should apply to each pair of lines that I've got now. So I need to end the keystroke macro, Control-Shift-R, and now I'm going to play it back. Control-Shift-P, P, 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 P. Okay, so that's the sort of case that keystroke macro record and playback comes in very useful for, where a certain number of changes can be thought up to apply to a number of similar lines to get the sort of effect that you need to make. It's basically allowing a computer to do repetitive tasks which are very tedious for the person to do. It's just a case of working out exactly what those tasks are. So many features, so little time. Just a quick thing on the form designer. Let's put a panel on here and pop these 2 things into the panel. Right, so if we want to move something not by one grid unit, which is the normal thing, Control cursor keys move it, Shift cursor keys resize it. If you want to lasso a bunch of things on a container, hold down the Control key. Escape will select the currently selected item's parent. On the object inspector, Control down arrow brings down the component list. Tab bounces you between the 2 columns, and plenty of other shortcuts. Check the online help, see if there's any other good ones that I've missed out on. Okay, so I think that's about all I've got time for there. Okay, so that was a fairly rapid fire run through of a whole bunch of productivity features, typically keystroke shortcuts. I hope that you've gained some useful tips out of there and will help you make use of the Delphi and C++ Builder IDEs more efficiently. If you've got any questions, obviously I hope you posted them on, and I can try and answer some of them now. Otherwise, send me an email, and also send me a mail if I can be of any service to your project. Thank you.
When I declare a method in a class, what shortcut to make the IDE generate the definition of the method automatically for me in C++ Builder?
Yeah, with C++, because the definition of a method is intended to span a couple of source files, there's not a single shortcut that does it. The Class Explorer does, however, have some lovely dialogues for adding properties, methods into a class sort of en masse, really. The class completion feature that we saw in the session there, I think, is a Delphi specific one, but the Class Explorer, which you can invoke with Control- or Control-, does allow a quick way of setting up the signature of a method and having it inserted in both the class declaration and in the source implementation. But I guess it's worth mentioning that that some of these features that we saw were done in the context of Delphi, but the point here is that the Delphi language and the C++ language both reside in the same IDE. So for 95% or so of cases, all the features for one language are exactly the same as in the other language. There are one or two subtle differences, such as the Class Explorer versus class completion, where it's useful to stipulate what the specifics are for one language or another. But by and large, any given feature for either Delphi or C++ works exactly the same for both languages. So when a C++ user is looking at somebody programming a bit of Delphi and using a few IDE features, one needn't be put off by the fact that it's not going to apply, because almost certainly it implies absolutely entirely, because it's the same development environment with the same feature set.
Yeah. Another question. I have a code template from BDS 2006. Is it just forward copy and paste to introduce into a newer version?
I don't have a copy of 2006 kicking around to check it, but I understand that live templates did come in around about 2005, 2006, and once the live template syntax was introduced, I'm pretty sure it stayed exactly as it was introduced, and so copy and paste should work. But that's based around my slightly hazy memory of when it was introduced. The original code templates used a different syntax. They were much simpler, and I'm pretty sure they don't work. So my understanding is that the live template syntax took over and entirely replaced the old simpler simple code template syntax. So as far as my memory goes, yeah, you should be able to move things forward from 2006, but that depends upon whether my recollection of the introduction of live templates is in the slightest bit accurate.
Okay. Does Delphi and C++, do they have the same compiler, or which one's faster?
Well, they're two different languages, and they do use different compilers. Ultimately, with the new CLang related or LLVM related backends that have just come into the 64-bit C++ compiler, with the same thing coming into Delphi, the backends will have a similar amount of functionality, but the front ends, they are different languages, so they have different compilers. The Delphi compiler has historically always been blindingly fast, and C++ historically hasn't been. But since the early days of C++ Builder, or possibly the late days of Ball and C++, I can't remember where it started changing over, the C++ compilation speed started ramping up significantly with the introduction of various optimizations, such as precompiled headers and so on. And you tend to find that C++ builds aren't anywhere near as slow as you might expect if you aren't that familiar with C++. But going to the question specifically, they're fairly similar compilation speeds, but C++ does have more work to do, either with the bulk of precompiled header files to read in and consume, or parsing header files. So I think probably Delphi will be slightly quicker. But C++ Builder does use the Delphi compiler from time to time, seeing as how the VCL and the FireMonkey frameworks are written in Delphi, but are then consumable by Delphi, and that is done by the Delphi compiler emitting header files for C++ Builder's use. So the Delphi compiler kind of gets used in C++ application life cycles, but they are different compilers.
Great. Is there a shortcut like Control Z to undo when you're in the form designer?
I think that one's been on the feature request list for a long time. I don't think there is, as far as I've bumped into. But a lot of people have asked for it very frequently over the years. I'm surprised that it hasn't got in there. But no, alas not. I think it's down to save regularly and dig out files from your hidden history folder if you make a mistake, which I think is possibly a clarion cry for everybody to pop along and find that feature request in Quality Central and vote for it.
Okay, good idea. Is there any hotkeys, templates, etc., that work in Delphi but not in C++, as far as you know?
The specific one, I guess, that works in Delphi but not in C++ would be the class completion one, the Control-Shift-C, where in C++ you use the Class Explorer and its functionality. Other than that, there probably are one or two, but none that bounce into my mind immediately. Although obviously in C++ you have the odd keystroke that doesn't exist in Delphi, like Control F6 for bouncing between the header and the source file. So yeah, there will be a couple, but it's only going to be a small handful, really.
Okay. Is there a list of all these shortcuts somewhere?
The online help does have a variety of lists of shortcuts, but as far as I've found, even when looking at the set lists, they're not actually complete. There are gaps in them. For example, Control OU, the toggle case option, which I use quite frequently, still isn't in there, although once upon a time when the help file used to be the old WinHelp format, it did used to be. So some things have slipped out, but most of them are in the online help if you look up the word shortcuts, plural, or indeed on DocWiki equivalently. And there's also, I did also summarize all of my favorite shortcuts, pretty much all of which I went through in this session, in a blog post. I'll see if I can drag up the URL and get that posted on the QA list.
I was actually going to ask if there's somebody out there that might have a blog that applies to this. So yeah, you go ahead and paste that. That'd be great.
Sure.
Cool. So Stephen Ball asks, we have Control-Shift-C for code completion in a class that doesn't exist in C++. So there's no way to make anything similar to make the method from the header in C++ Builder. Is that right?
Not if you've typed in one in the source file and you want the other one typed in the corresponding source file. I don't think so. I think the idea is you use the Class Explorer to get both of them added in, and that's the option, which frankly I think is great because it's a nice little selection box. There's less to type in if you use the Class Explorer entry box, and it's even better when you come to typing in properties. You can get a whole bunch of stuff typed in for free via the property edition option in the C++ Builder Class Explorer.
Okay. Is it possible to remap keyboard shortcuts?
It's not quite as straightforward as you might expect, given something like Word or whatever, where you can just say, I want this option and redefine it to this keystroke mapping. But there is the facility for building your own personal key bindings. And in fact, I think there are a couple of sample wizards or experts, which tools API add-ins, which are supplied, which demonstrate how you can set up your own custom key binding. So I guess you could kind of do it, but it's probably not as easy as the questioner is wanting it to be.
Okay. So Samwise is adding here that undo of cut delete works in XE3 in the form designer, at least for VCL forms. It's only one level undo redo though. But it does not work for other property settings, reverting property settings, reverting and moving of a button, resize, etc.
Okay.
Doc Insight is only for Delphi at this time, is that right?
Do you know what? Whilst listening to myself talking about documentation insight, I did suddenly wonder whether all the XML syntax highlighting and the documentation insight was supported in C++ Builder, and concluded that actually probably that isn't the case. So Class Explorer and documentation insight might be the Delphi specific bits. I think everything else was applicable, unless I hear further to the contrary.
Okay. And about key mappings, there's a under Tools option editor speed setting. There's default key mapping, brief, epsilon, etc. So there's a few different to choose from.
Yeah, so there are a selection of predefined ones if you have certain historic editors that you have an affinity to. So yeah, WordStar is the classic keystroke mapping. Windows is the default keystroke mapping, and we have brief and epsilon. I don't know if anybody's still alive that uses the epsilon editor key binding, but they are there as options to try. But actually customizing them specifically, that's a bit tricky.
Sounds good. If there are any more questions, please feel free to put them in right now. Did you locate your blog post?
Yeah, I've got the URL. I'm just wondering how to post it in now.
You can actually just click on one of the two questions that are related to it.
Oh yeah, that would be a good.
And then just paste the URL in and hit enter, I think.
Okie dokie. Something like that.
Then. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you very much. Awesome. Samwise is also saying there's a keyboard options choice to use Control or Control-Alt keys. Okay, so there are no more questions at this point, and we're about 5 minutes from the top of the hour. So I want to thank Brian Long, one of our MVPs as well. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you.